Welcome, everyone. My name is Julene Jackson. I'm the National Vice President for Moms for America over Cottage Meetings. Moms for America, a wonderful organization that really teaches liberty begins at home. And if Mama knows the miracles and the stories of America and loves our founding fathers, her children will know this. Her grandchildren will know this. We can't count on the school systems teaching these things to our children anymore. But mamas are the best teachers her children and her grandchildren will ever have. And so when mom knows certain things, inevitably the people she loves the most, she naturally turns and teaches them. And this is what Moms for America is. We teach these ideas, these concepts, principles of liberty and freedom and patriotism. And then we go home and we teach our children, our husbands, and those around us. I've been involved with Moms for America and attending cottage meetings for over 12 years, and I'll share a little bit about that at the end. I always do. I've woven this through the last 10 weeks that we've been meeting. We are on, I believe, ladies, our 10th or 11th week of coming together. Are you feeling like we're a sisterhood of moms and grandmas across America? You are not alone. I want you to know that. So girls, we are in Seminar 3, The Attacks of Our Charter of Freedom. These books are $12. You can get them online. They're wonderful. They're fill in the blanks, and you could just use them as a workbook, write all over them, take notes in them. Seminar 1, we talked about God's hand in building of America, Joan of Arc, Christopher Columbus, the stories of the Pilgrim, the founding fathers, the miracles, the events, the miracle of the Constitution Convention, just delicious stories we talked about there. I hope you were able to share some of those stories with your kids, with your grandkids. And then Seminar 2, we studied the Constitution from the viewpoint of the founding fathers. What did they intend when they said it was struck off by the hand of God, that they very much knew that God was in the writing of the Constitution? Thomas Jefferson said they were going to be eternal principles. What did he mean by that? We learned that there are 7 articles, leg cessar, and there's 27 amendments. We learned about what the founders gave us and what has come since the founders and how it has kind of disrupted some of the intentions that the founders gave us for this republic. And we will talk about that next week, some of the attacks on the Constitution because of some of the changes we've made to the Constitution. And then today we're talking in Seminar 3, we're talking about the attacks on America. Why are we in the mess and the situation that we are? Last week in section 1, we talked about educational reformers that purposely wanted to take God and religion and morality out of the schools and the impact that that is having on our children today. We're seeing it almost daily now with some of the way these young people are acting out in society. Just yesterday, another mass shooting of a 21-year-old, and a week ago, another 21-year-old. And we'll talk a little bit about that today and how what they're not being taught in schools is impacting their mental health and ability to process life and the temptations that they might encounter. And so then after today's class, we'll have 2 more sections of the attacks on America. So this seminar talks about this great door of America that kind of stays firmly shut, that keeps us safe and protected, but how the door, the hinges have gotten kind of loose and it's kind of hanging ajar now. And why are the hinges of this great door? Why are we loose and barely hanging in there? Today, we're going to talk about the assault on the moral fiber of America. Our founders intended religion and morality to be woven all throughout aspects of our government and throughout our society, and how that has been attacked through the years and how that came to be. So girls, there's a lot of material here in section 2 today, and I can't possibly get through it all, and I will have to skim through some of it. So please go back and reread it and spend a little time each day, just a couple pages a day. Girls, I go through about 3 pages a day every single day in order to prepare to teach this lesson. So it's just a part of my, routine of Bible study. And, some of the other things I learn is my constitutional studies. And I do about 3 pages a day, and that allows me to have the section kind of firm in my mind, and I am ready to teach and discuss it with you. And I would recommend every day just going through a few pages. And if there's something you don't understand, pick up your phone and Google and try and get more information on, sometimes Wikipedia is not always true. So, everything you pull up on Google is not truth, but it will help fill in some of the questions you might have with your little studies. And then it will make our conversations really meaningful as we come together each week on Wednesday. And so anyways, let's go right to our section 2 of seminar 3, entitled The Assault on the Moral Fiber of America. Now, George Washington himself said religion and morality were indispensable supports to the political prosperity of this nation and this new form of government, this republic. And keep in mind, republics have been around since, all ages of time. But the way they put together the checks and balances and the separations of power were unique, and no one in the world had ever seen this type of republic before. And so our founders knew, unless the people remained morally strong and virtuous and elected morally strong and virtuous leaders, we could not maintain this special type of republic based on people's law, which is based on God's law. And so here we go. By the early 1830s, now this is 43 years after the Constitution has been written. In the early 1830s, our founding fathers' constitutional principles were really taking hold in America. And, the little local communities were all establishing their own standards of decency and morality, because our founding fathers wanted strong local self-government to be the keystone to be able to really preserve freedom in this country. So the problems that little towns and states were having, they wanted them to be solved at the local level. They didn't want us to look across the nation 3,000 miles away to Washington, D.C. to solve their problems. And so communities were establishing their own standards of morality and decency, and religions, all types of religions were being accepted and were sound religion, of course, were being integrated into the society and the moral fabric of this new country. And remember, we talked about the Northwest Ordinance that the founding fathers passed the same year that the Constitution was written in 1887. And it talked about all these new territories that were going to start coming into this new country. Look there, that little diorama: Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. They wanted no slavery allowed into these new territories at the time. And they also wanted 3 things taught to the children in the schools: religion, morality, and knowledge. They knew that that was imperative. The children not only be taught book smart knowledge, but religion and morality, because they knew that children behave according to what they've been taught. And so if they were not going to be taught about the government and the Constitution, we would lose the Constitution. And if they were not taught about God and self-governance and these principles of moral character, we would lose this type of government that is based on the voice of the people being righteous and looking to God, and the way, we treat one another when we are God-fearing people. And so Abraham Lincoln himself said, the philosophy of the classroom in one generation will be the philosophy of the government in the next. So our founders wanted religion and morality and these principles to continue to be taught to the children so we could perpetuate what they gave us, this form of government. So remember that French legal author, Alec de Tocqueville, who in 1930 wrote the book Democracy in America. He was so fascinated by this new little country after 40 years, why it was thriving and all the people of the world were looking to America. What was going on, this new little founded country? So he came over to America in 1930, and he wanted to know why, his little country of France was in shambles after the French Revolution in the late 1700s. So he wanted to know, he said, there is no country in the world where Christian religion retains a greater influence over the souls of men than in America. He writes that in his book, Democracy in America. And he would go on to say, you know, I wanted to know why America was so great. What was the genius of America? Did it lie in its harbors or its fields, its prairies, its mines, its commerce? And he said, it wasn't until I went to the churches of America and I heard her pulpits aflame with righteousness did I understand the secret of her genius and her power. And so de Tocqueville would say that he saw how the ministers of America taught their people these standards of morality and religious beliefs should be integrated into every segment of society, even into education and politics. And even though they believed in the separation of church and state, there was not a separation of religion and state. Now, remember that how they took what Thomas Jefferson said about that separation of church and state to the Connecticut Baptists, him meaning they didn't want a state, a national religion like they had just come from in England, the Church of England. Everyone had to belong to the Church of England. He didn't want a national religion. He wanted the states to decide how people worship the religion. And so, and we know that, you know, what our founders intended sound religion was not a particular denomination, a Baptist, a Catholic, an Episcopalian. They said the tenets of sound religion were also in Judaism and Hinduism and Buddhism, that there is a creator, that there is a right and wrong, that there's an absolute code of right and wrong, that you're going to be judged about how we treat one another, and that there is an afterlife, there's an eternal soul, and we will be judged by God on how we live. Those were the 5 tenets our founders said were the tenets of sound religion. And so you see now in the early 1830s up until the 90s, there began to be some changes in religion that were going to shake this spiritual mooring which our country was founded on. Now, remember last week how we talked about McGuffey, this wonderful educator and writer, and he wrote the McGuffey Readers. And this is what children for about 50, 60 years were learning how to read in school, these little readers that taught little religious stories of the 10 Commandments, little Bible stories, the Golden Rule in their little readers. And there's an example of a page of a reader. Do you see that in your book? A little story of when to say no. So this is just an example of how these kids were being taught what they were, you know, they weren't reading Dick, Jane, and the doggy Spot. They were actually reading things that were like substantive, that were teaching them things to read in the little section for there. When we are tempted to use angry or wicked words, we should remember that the eye of God is always upon us, and we should say no. When we have done anything wrong and we are tempted to conceal it by falsehood, we should say, no, we cannot tell a lie. It is wicked and cowardly. Now, wouldn't you love your little kids or your grandkiddies to be learning how to read in school, reading this kind of stuff, you know? So, you know, mamas and grandmas, I would really recommend investing in the McGuffey Readers. You can get them online at Amazon. I did. I would show you my McGuffey Readers if I weren't traveling. I had my library with me. But, you know, instead of when the grandkids come over and reading at Disney, or they're so proud to show you how they can read, pull out a little McGuffey Reader and have them read that. And imagine the little conversations you could have as they're reading these little McGuffey Readers. And so, yes, Vivian, did you have something?
Yes, I just Googled it, and the readers are available online for free. So if you can download the PDF. So if you just search McGuffey Readers, you'll find those.
So that's good. If you want a hard copy, you'll have to pay. I think I paid maybe $75 for it. I got like 8 books, but I think, you know, women, I always say you want to build your library of I Love America, books that are inspiring to you and books that you can pull out and read to your children and to your grandchildren. So, you know, at the time, these McGuffey Readers sold more books in the country than any other book available at the time. They sold 120 million of these books, except for the Bible and the dictionary. These were the best-selling books in the day at that time, in the 1800s. So as a result of kids learning, how to read through these little readers, these children were growing up with a strong moral principles and spiritual strength and a patriotic love of liberty and the Constitution. Unfortunately, however, these spiritual and patriotic philosophies were about to be challenged by the educational reformers that we learned about last week. Horace Mann, he was born in 1850, died, in the early 1900s, and John Dewey. Now, you will recall Horace Mann believed, he was a humanist, and so he believed that we should be separated from the divine and that humans are best able to solve human problems, not God. We don't look to God. That's, religion should not be a part of everyday life, he believed, and that mankind was the measure of all things, not God, and that there's no absolute rights and wrongs. And we should teach our children that, we base our values on the situation at the time, like situational ethics. And, Horace Mann and John Dewey, if you were to look at them and be a school teacher and go to your, education department at the universities, they will hold up these men as great men, like father of public religion, father of father of public education, and father of modern education. This is how these men are taught in the universities. And we know Horace Mann, there are hundreds of Horace Mann elementaries and middle schools around this country. People just don't know the background of what these men really believed, and we're trying to infiltrate and remove moral education from the schools. So while this was going on in the 1800s and then early 1900s, there were two educators in Europe, see if these names sound familiar, that began to publish their own writings for a new age. And their philosophies one day, 100 years later, from the time they were going to live, are going to have a devastating impact on America. Karl Heinrich Marx. Have you heard of Karl Marx? Born in Germany in 1818, he only lived to 64. He was one of these educators. He grew up in Germany, went to the university there, and became intoxicated with a philosopher, Epicurus. He was an ancient Greek philosopher who didn't believe in God. And Marx himself said, "I see no need for a creator since matter seems to create itself." And Marx would go on to call his thesis in college, he entitled "In One Word, I Hate All Gods." This is Karl Marx. It was a German social revolutionary. Just know, wherever Marxist ideas, they're communistic, socialistic, government controls everyone and everything. Wherever Marxist ideas have prevailed in the world, life has always gotten worse for people that live under these Marxist principles. There's not one single exception to this rule in the history since Marx was born, because his ideas enslaved people. He was an atheist. He tried to infect German society with his revolutionary ideas, but they weren't really going for it. And in a future letter that he wrote to his wife, Jenny, he said, "Jenny, if we can just come together and weld our souls, then with contempt shall I fling my glove in the world's face, and then shall I stride through the wreckage, a creator himself." And, he would go on to marry his Jenny. They had 7 children. 4 of them died in childhood. 2 committed suicide, and 1 would die of cancer. And this Marx, who was going to go on to change the world and impact the world, died a penniless man. He was in exile. No one in Germany wanted him. He died in a 1-bedroom apartment in London. And he drank, he was impoverished, but his ideas were going to take root in a horrible way. His little cohort, Frederick Engel, they rallied around these communist ideas. They wrote the Communist Manifesto. They came up with these ideas and these ideas were primarily, they wanted to destroy Christianity and Judeo-Christian values. These two, Marx and Engels, became the founders of modern communistic thought. And they used every economic crisis to replace what they called industrial capitalism with communism. And they wrote the Communist Manifesto. It's an anti-Christian, anti-constitutional treaty, and it has had tremendous influence on Europe and gained later momentum in the United States. Girls, I'm going to recommend a book. I really would recommend getting it. It's called The Naked Communist. It was a bestseller written in 1959 by Cleon Skousen, who has written these Healing of America seminars that we're studying. This book found its way into the libraries of Congress, the FBI, the White House. Presidents of the United States has read this book. It's not outdated at all, even though it was written in 1959, because it shows you how these communist ideas have permeated into every aspect of our country and really countries around the world, as it presents what communism really is, stripped of all of its romanticism and propaganda. Cecil B. DeMille, who was that famous producer and director of the Ten Commandments and Samson and Delilah, a real famous director in Hollywood, was good friends with Cleon Skousen. And it was Cecil B. DeMille who came up with this title for this book, The Naked Communist. It's a really easy read. It's not difficult at all. And you need to read it to understand the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto by Marx has almost come to pass in America. And it's chilling to read it, but it's helpful to understand, how the minds of the enemies think. So I would get it and read it if you can. So, Horace Mann and Marx and Engels, they all declared their kind of loyalty and fascination to Plato. Remember Plato, that Greek philosopher born in 427 BC? He only lived to 51 years as well, Plato did. But they incorporated Plato's ideas into public education. And Plato believed in this utopian society where we could do away with the family and raise kids and state nurseries, so to speak, and do away with religion and adopt a political religion. Nowadays, you might say the religion of America, the political religion, is irreligion. We got to protect the irreligious. We don't want to offend them. And Plato, some of these ideas that Marxism and our educational reformers in America, Horace Mann and Dewey, are rooted in some of Plato's ideas of disallowing the public to tell lies, but the government can. And, as I think about how they're doing that now with this crazy censorship that we're seeing with people that have different ideas, they're calling them lies and dangerous and destructive. So we've got to censor them, or we need to black out social media of certain people's, the sea of misinformation, that we're getting from the government is allowed. And I think of what the government is telling us about COVID and about the elections. And you're like, yeah, wow, Plato would have been proud of how, some of our operating of the information in our country today. And compelling women to go to war along with men. Boy, we've seen that. That was certainly some of the hopes of the ERA in the 70s. Governed by the whims of men and ruler, not by law. Whatever the popular trend or philosophy of the day is, should be the basis of the law of the day. And Plato also wanted dictatorial control over the people, a tyranny. So that's speculum of we have anarchy on one hand and tyranny on the other, and the founders founded our republic right in the center on people's law, God's law. But as we get away from God and look more to the state, we swing more towards this tyrannical dictatorship kind of, where we look to government, the executive branch, to tell us, when we can meet and how we can live. This is all based in some of these ancient thinkers, Plato and so forth. Our founders despised Plato. You need to know that. Jefferson said, he called his writings utter nonsense. And John Adams wrote a letter to Jefferson talking about Plato and how he had the severe task of going through Plato, and it was a tedious toil, he told Jefferson, and with great astonishment and disgust. Our founders were great students, and they studied the ancient thinkers of Cicero and Montesquieu and John Locke and Plato and Aristotle, and they picked out from these great minds some of the best things. Primarily, they picked out of Deuteronomy, Exodus, and Numbers, representative government from Moses, the tens, the hundreds, the thousands, and local problems solved, at the local level kind of thing. They got that from the Bible. But so as they studied these ideas, they were our founders were reading out of the same books, and they were able to formulate and give us this country and these inspired documents of the Declaration and so forth. But they did not like Plato. But isn't it interesting, Marx, Horace Mann, and Dewey, they very much like Plato. So at the same time that we have Marxism and some of our, Horace Mann coming along in the mid 1800s, Congress attempted to clarify more closely what the original founders, believed in the importance of religion. And in 1864 is when they began to put on our coins, "In God we trust." And they said, look, this is an appropriate motto. We are a Christian nation. So they began to put it on all our coins. And this phrase came right from the Star-Spangled Banner, Star-Spangled Anthem that Francis Scott Key wrote in 1814 during the War of 1812. And he writes in that line in the Star-Spangled Banner, our national anthem, and this be our motto: in God is our trust. Remember singing that? Girls, can I just give a recommendation? There is the most wonderful 11-minute YouTube video you can pull up online called "The Story Behind the Star-Spangled Banner." The story behind the Star-Spangled Banner. It's only like 11 minutes. It's a YouTube video, and it tells the story of "In God We Trust," how the flag was still waving after that 25 hours of that constant bombardment by the British, and how that flagpole was not pelted down by the rockets. And show it to your kids over breakfast, or send it to your adult kids. And it's a tearjerker. It's kind of old fashioned. So, give it a minute or two, but it's a beautiful story upon which it was founded, and the sacrifice and the toll to keep that flagpole upright. And that flag today is in the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. So girls, I've said this before, but put that on your bucket list. Fort McHenry in Baltimore, and the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., to see that beautiful flag and to know the story of how that flag still was waving after 25 hours of the fort being bombed. It's a beautiful story. Okay, so now we're at the early 1900s. We're clicking away here, girls. Are you with me? The father of modern education, our wonderful John Dewey, who's extolled in the educational world today. You go to universities, and if you're a school teacher, you're going to be taught about John Dewey, and he's not the Dewey Decimal System. That's another Dewey. But as previously mentioned, John Dewey believed with Horace Mann in this messianic character of education, with the state as the true church and education as the Messiah. And he organized this educational delivery system, and then Dewey put this system into play with a progressive education in a book that he wrote. John Dewey taught at Columbia University, the School of Columbia's Teachers College in New York City, for 26 years. And he taught these ideas, John Dewey did, to all the students and to the future presidents and deans of universities. They say at that time in 1950, 1/3 of all the presidents and deans of teachers training schools and teachers were being taught this. At that time, it was the only teacher school in the nation in 1950. And today, the Columbia's Teachers College is the oldest and largest graduate school of education in the US. And they extol John Dewey as the most notable alumni and former faculty member. But this is what Dewey taught. And this is what he believed. He not only taught in New York City at Columbia, but he was the president of the American Humanist association. And his own words are right here, girls, in your writing. I believe in no God. It is immoral to indoctrinate children with such belief. Schools have no right to do so, nor indeed have parents. I believe that religious education and prayers in schools should be eliminated. I believe that children should be taught religion as a matter of historical interest, but they should also be taught about all religions, including humanism, he includes that as a religion, Marxism, Maoism, and communism. And he says, I mean, I know as I'm reading this, you're clutching your bosoms. This is the father of modern education that is revered in these circles even today. He says, unborn babies are not people. I am as yet unsure whether the grossly handicapped are people in the very real sense. I believe there is no such thing as sin to be forgiven and no life beyond the grave, but death everlasting. And this is known. And he is held up in our education system today and amongst teachers in the universities today. And so as these philosophies of Horace Mann and John Dewey came to be in the 1950s, they really were resisted by many Americans, but there began to be, in the early 1900s, Horace Mann, and then John Dewey kind of comes into his own in 1920, 30, 40, 50s. There begins to be a transformation in the early 1900s of America. World War I has occurred, and now there began to be some distractions here in America. After World War I, we come into the Roaring 20s, a time of real prosperity under a great president, Calvin Coolidge. He believed in small government and capitalism, and so we flourished under this president. And during this time when Americans were enjoying real prosperity that they hadn't seen almost ever, there was also a force going on in Russia. The Russian president by the name of Vladimir Lenin, does that sound familiar? In the 1920s, he was born in 1870 and died in 1924 at 54. Some of these evil men die young, which is good. He died at 54. But he was the communist dictator of Russia at the time that this was going on in the early 1900s, and America was the Russia's enemy. And he hired two prominent scholars and an unknown artist at the time to come up with a scheme directed at the religious beliefs of American people, because he probably had read Democracy in America. Some of the strength of America was our morality and our religious nature and belief in God. And he knew that it was music and art that many Americans expressed their religious and sacred beliefs. So he wanted to attack the music and art. This was fascinating to me when I first learned this, girl. So he wanted to come up with two forms of expression that could, through music and art, that could weaken our country. So he hired a Russian physiologist named Pavlov. Remember Pavlov and conditioned reflex? Every time the doggy eats, he rings the bell and they know it's time to eat. And so every time a doggy hears the bell, they start to salivate because they know it's time to eat. So he was an expert in this conditioned reflex. And Pavlov came up with these theories and findings of how music could be a major force in mind controlling people. The rhythm of music could control the human mind. So all of his findings were given to a Russian neuropsychologist, A.R. Luria, at the time. And he wrote a book entitled The Nature of Human Conflict and subtitled An Objective Study of Disorganization and Control of Human Behavior. And Luria, this neuropsychologist, described his findings in great detail about how you can nerve jam children through music, and younger children can actually become retarded mentally and even animalized by different types of music. So keep that in mind, how that was going to be used against Americans a few decades later. And then Lenin, this Russian dictator president of Russia, employed an obscure artist at the time, a Spanish artist that was living in Europe by the name of Pablo Picasso. Picasso. And he wanted Picasso to create art that would destroy faith and belief in traditions and beauty and kind of promote class struggle. And he wanted him to introduce him to new art, modern art, that would turn the mind from what had been good and true and beautiful to kind of ugly and distorted and sordid. And hence, if you look at, there's a little example of some of Picasso's paintings. Some people might think that's beautiful because they've gotten used to that form of art. But at that time, that was really radicalized art. Girls, I'm going to tell you an interesting story. About 8 years ago, my husband is involved with the Thomas Jefferson Center for Constitutional Studies. Now, my husband is just a businessman. He's not an educator, but he was teaching these classes, much like I'm teaching you, to people around the country. And somehow the founders of the San Francisco Academy of Art got wind of my husband and what he taught, and wanted him to come out, flew me and my husband out to San Francisco to meet them because they wanted my husband to teach these things, this type of American history, to their art students in San Francisco. This was like in 2013. And so they flew us out, and we did, it's a privately owned art academy. It's the largest privately owned art school in America today, the Academy of Art in San Francisco. It's a beautiful school right downtown San Francisco, very prominent, prestigious in that city. But they said something that I will never forget. So they took us out to lunch, and then someone gave us a tour of the campus. And then the next day they sent for a car and they took us to their home a little bit outside of San Francisco. It's amazing. They're an incredibly wealthy family. Their grandfather had founded the school. His son was the president of the school at the time 8 years ago, and his daughter was going to become the president. She is the president now. Her name is Elizabeth Stevens. And so I'll never forget sitting in their beautiful dining room 8 years ago, and they sang, and me and Al are still kind of trying to wonder why they, are even interested in Alvin teaching. And they said they have noticed through the years that the students and their art have gotten progressively darker. It is less inspired, less imaginative. And they believed it was because young people had not been taught about the greatness of America or the beauty associated with our history. I thought that was fascinating. And at the time they told us that, I didn't know what to make of it. But as I've taught this and came to know about Picasso, I understood this more. They did not go on to have Al teach. And I think the reality is they really saw what he was going to teach. It was too risky to them to teach something like that in San Francisco, and the pushback that they would have gotten from the school and from the city. But this was their concern. The type of art that they were seeing, they felt had deteriorated through the years. And that school had been in existence since 1929. And it was 2018 when they had Al and I out for a weekend. So the effects of Pavlov and Picasso and Luria didn't really have an immediate impact on American culture in the early 1920s, but you would see about 40, 50 years later in the 1960s what kind of impact art and music was going to have on the young people. So we're at the 1940s and 50s now, and it's entitled, the subtitle, Are You Following Me? I'm moving fast through our section 2 here in the book. It's entitled Society's Experimental Years. And 1940s was World War II, girls, and that's when all the men left for war, and the girls, mamas, left the homes and worked in the factories, and then everyone came home and they had the GI Bill and they were getting educated. And so this time period in our history had a twofold impact. First of all, World War II created a spirit of patriotism that hadn't been seen in years in America, that would extend after the war's end into the mid and late 50s, when it was known as the greatest generation, people that had been raised up in the Depression and then participated in World War II, the greatest generation. But what it also did, it came at a time when our attentions were being diverted, during this war period, and it allowed those who were attempting to impose atheism and socialism and other anti-American aspects into our school. Hence, we see John Dewey really picking up steam and momentum. And we also see in the early 1900s and the mid 1900s, the Supreme Court getting involved with court cases that are now removing religion from school. We're starting to see, the amendments 16 and 17 disrupting the balance of power, the checks and balances in our constitutional government, and prayer being taken out of school by the Supreme Court, these court cases, Bible reading being taken out of school, being able to say the Lord's Prayer being taken out of school. And so after World War II, we go into this period of the Cold War, in the 1950s, 55, and Russia, Soviet Union is really deemed as our enemy, and they hate America, and they threaten nuclear wars and attacks. And these Soviet Union leaders who are atheists are coming forth with repeated attacks on the United States. There's a very interesting conversation that took place in 1959 between the president of Russia at that time, Khrushchev. Have you heard of him? Nikita Khrushchev in 1959. The Secretary of Agriculture, Ezra Taft Benson, under President Eisenhower, had a very interesting conversation with President Khrushchev of Russia. And Khrushchev said to Secretary Benson, "Your children will live under communism someday." And Secretary Benson said, "My grandchildren will live under freedom, as I hope all people in the world will." And Khrushchev then said, "You Americans are so gullible. You won't accept communism outright, but we will feed you small doses of socialism until you finally wake up and find that you already have communism. We won't have to fight you. We will weaken your economy until you fall like overripe fruit into our hands." And so isn't that an interesting conversation almost, 60 years ago, that these leaders were declaring the intentions to spread their communistic ideas and dictatorship worldwide at that time. And so people were afraid in the 50s and 60s of this nuclear attack by the Russians. And pacifists in our country at that time said, let's make friends with them. It's better to join with them and have an alliance. It's better to be red than dead. But conservatives and patriots at this time declared, we would rather be dead than red. So it created a real highly emotional atmosphere in our country in the late 50s and going into 60s. And then what happened in the late 50s? Remember, Russia beat us into space. They launched the first Russian satellite, and we got all nervous in America. We're falling behind. Our education is failing us. And we look to the government to take more of a role in the education, whatever you think our kids need to learn, so we're not beaten by the Russians. And so, and studies have shown even and uncovered that launch of that Russian Sputnik in 1957 was actually based on American technology. And Americans went over there and helped them do that because they wanted to create a climate for change in America. They wanted us to be open to the idea of looking to the government that, we're under threat by the Russians. What do you think we should do? And so these social scientists came on board. And in our effort to try and catch the Russians, they now said, okay, we're going to focus more on exact sciences. We're going to get rid of the liberal arts. We're going to remove constitutional studies and traditional history from the classrooms. We're going to replace civics and American history with social studies, which is just a study of cultures and, societies. And we're only going to make kids have half a year of social studies, and we're going to let the gym teacher, the football coach teach it because it requires minimal preparation. And hence, that's what most of our kids are getting nowadays. And so you'll notice up until that point, America had been leading the world in the early, 50s in education. And ever since we made those changes in the late 50s, moving into the 60s and 70s, removing, this kind of teaching to our children and religion and morality and reverence for our founders and our Constitution, we have drastically dropped. Look at the charts there in our seminar. We had drastically dropped our rankings of education amongst the industrial countries, the first world countries. We used to be at the top. Now we're at the middle and even at the bottom amongst some of the first world countries. So we head into the turbulent 60s, and we had forced integration, we had more women going out in the workplace, latchkey kids, TV dinners, the Civil War, the unpopular or the civil rights movement, the unpopular Vietnam War, kids growing up with TV, making parents look like they're buffoons instead of father knows best. Now parents are just clueless and, idiots. And new terminology was coming in. Sexual and deviant practices in the 60s were being accepted as alternative, acceptable lifestyles, exotic grooming and hairstyles, and they were really promoting this idea in schools of a generation gap. Your parents are old-fashioned, the values that they are teaching you or had your grandparents are non-progressive, they're obsolete, they're too restricted to your development. And so we saw all this kind of transformation going on in the 60s, and prayer was completely removed in the 60s in 1962 by a Supreme Court decision. It's so interesting. Last week, I noted a football coach that was fired several years ago in the state of Washington. This is a recent example because he would have the football team pray at the 50-yard line after the games for those that wanted to, and he was fired. And so he took them to court, and it went all the way up to the district court and then to the circuit court, the Ninth Circuit Court. I mean, that's the level right underneath the Supreme Court. And the Ninth Circuit Court ruled against this teacher because they said that students praying, they might feel pressured, and that it was a violation of the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment, where it says the church or the government can't establish a religion. So by this they use the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. Can you imagine that? To say that he can't pray after the game because it was school property. And isn't it interesting, though, that the U.S. Congress, every single day Congress is in session, they have a prayer. So those men and women understand the importance of prayer, but yet we don't want our children who are at such crossroads of their life praying, because that might be harmful or destructive to their little hearts and minds and learning, which I think is so interesting. Remember that famous prayer that was offered at the first day of Congress in January when the man said, "Amen," and "A woman." Ay, ay, ay. But, I guess at least they're still praying. Our kids are not praying, that's for sure, in school. So in 1970, we see this widening gap between, God-fearing people and people that don't want any mention of God, that are atheists in the school systems. And it was almost like we were living that George Orwell book that he wrote in 1949 that he entitled, remember, 1984, where he describes a community as a total totalitarian society where the government was pretty much running everything with this elite society. And we see here, there's a quote, we were starting to abandon the old in favor of the new, this idea of this new way to teach, this modern way of teaching. And ultimately the goal of this modern system of education was infiltrating into the school systems. In the Humanist magazine, it says the classroom must and will become an arena of conflict between the old and the new, the rotting corpse of Christianity, together with all of its adjacent evils and misery, and the new faith of humanism. Remember, humanism is completely anti-God. This is what John Dewey was. He was the president of the Humanist Society. One of the most dismaying comments from a Harvard professor in 1973, delivered to 2,000 teachers in Denver, Colorado. He said, "Every child in America entering school at the age of 5 is mentally ill because he comes to school with certain allegiances towards our founding fathers, towards our elected officials, towards his parents, towards a belief in the supernatural being." And also at the same time in the 70s, remember Gloria Steinem, our famous feminist? She was the editor of Ms. Magazine, and she actually said, "By the year 2000, we will, I hope, raise our children to believe in human potential, not God." And she also would go on to say, "For the sakes of those who wish to live in equal partnerships, we have to abolish and reformed the institution of marriage, echoing the humanistic promotion of divorce. And boy, she would be proud to see how some of her, sayings have come to pass. Girls, I have another really good recommendation for you. Last year on Amazon Prime, a movie came out called Miss America. It has 10 episodes. Miss MRS America. Have you heard of it? And it's the story of Gloria Steinem and the feminist movement and how they clashed with the conservative activist Phyllis Schlafly, who was the great, mama and president of the Eagle Forum, and the history of how that ERA, was almost passed, that Equal Rights Amendment, and it will kind of make you mad as you're watching it. But I watch it with my girls who are 24 and 21, and a lot of Gloria Steinem, they portray her as so beautiful and so hip and progressive and forward thinking. And then Phyllis Schlafly, she's played by Cate Blanchett. And it just came out in 2020. It's good. And it will help you understand how that feminist movement began to take root and how we're seeing some of the fruits of that today. And so, if you don't have anything to watch this weekend, get some popcorn and watch Miss America on Amazon Prime, even though we don't like Amazon Prime because they took off Clarence Thomas's beautiful documentary. But anyway, so here we are in the 1980s, continuing the slide with humanist John Goodlad, who worked with the NEA, the National Education Association. You know how powerful they are. And he said, our goal is behavioral change. The majority of our youth still hold to the values of their parents, and we do not re-socialize them. And if we do not re-socialize them to accept change, our society may decay. Now, all the sources of everything I'm teaching you is right here in these handbooks. I'm not just making this stuff up, So you've got all the sources of sightings. And then a Reverend Sills from Virginia would go on to quote John Dewey at a conference where he said, John Dewey taught that if the public school systems can keep kids occupied from 7 or 7:30 in the morning throughout the day with sports, after school, and homework in the evening, the parents will have less than an hour with their children, and the families and Christian churches' influence over them could be broken in about a generation. Hitler taught that too. He had these youth groups and they keep them real busy and remove them out of the homes. Girls, this is a profound thing that has happened in the last several decades. As we went from the red house schoolroom where all the kids, big brother was taught with little sister, and they kind of kept their eye on each other, to dividing the kids and isolating them and separating them. And anyone that has high school kids know they leave at 7:30 in the morning. And if they have activities after school, they don't get home till 7 at night. And this was done by design, because the two deterrents to changing a kid's mind, John Dewey said, was God and was the mother, because he knew the mother was the most influential and best teacher that child would have. It's so interesting to read what our founding fathers say about their mothers. If I had my book, I'd show you the real George Washington and how he talked about his mother, Mary Ball Washington. He said they were at odds with each other often because she was a strong-willed woman. And he often called his mama the Reverend Mother. And he says, she led me through my childhood because he lost his father when he was a young boy. When George Washington was 14 years old, because he was large in stature and he looked older than 14, he was going to join the British Navy. His bags were packed. And she pled and she begged. I mean, have you ever done this when your kid was going to do something really stupid and you have to yell, scream, cry, whatever? And this is what she did. So he would not go off to the British Navy. And so he didn't go because he says, because of her earnest solicitations, he did not go and join the Navy. And imagine how the history of America might have been different if we had lost George Washington to the British Navy. And because of the promptings of an inspired mother, he attributes, And so these godless men knew they had to break the bond of a mother. And it's very sweet how Thomas Jefferson talks about his mother as well in his book, The Real Thomas Jefferson. So by the 1990s, those that were kind of in the closets, living and believing these ideas, are fully out of the closet now. And it says here, by the 1990s, the community leaders were graduates of this American educational system, which had now become void of traditional and moral training. This is probably a lot of you and me. I graduated in 87. I graduated from college in 97. I mean, I loved America and I loved, the founding fathers, but I didn't really know much about them. I can't really say I really remember being taught a lot about the Constitution or the miracles of America or our founding fathers. And hence what happened in the 90s is our confidence in our founding fathers began to wane. And because we lacked the understanding of the moral society that the founders had given us, we believed some of these stories that we were hearing about our founding fathers, because we hadn't been taught about them really in schools. And so we began to believe in 1990s, when all of Thomas Jefferson, Illegitimate Kids by Sally Heming, those stories began to surface, and the immorality of Benjamin Franklin, he was a womanizer, and the racism of George Washington and all of his slaves. And the lack of knowledge that we have, that our kids have, that I even had coming up, led us to be very vulnerable to programs that were directly opposing our founding fathers. And girls, what we're seeing right now, if you've heard about it, is the 1619 critical race theory curriculum that the school boards are being given and are now pushing on to the local school districts to teach to their children. And and it's being embraced. Can I just tell you, my husband is doing work giving alternatives to school boards around the country. And he talked to the largest school district in Utah yesterday, and they're desperate for an alternative to the 1619 curriculum. They don't want to teach it to their kids, but this is what the government will give them money. There's always strings attached. If you will accept this curriculum, you will get large amounts of money to teach this to the children. But, some of these superintendents don't want to teach it to their children. But the school boards the state school boards are promoting it to the school districts. And so Al said, Julene, it was as if Jesus Christ and John the Baptism walked in, and when I presented me and his business partner, an alternative kind of steeped in the 1776 curriculum, what Donald Trump wanted to teach before he, lost the election. And so, what is happening now is, these kind of radical ideas that were kind of being underground are completely out, and they're not even being subtle about it anymore. In fact, these irreligious community leaders and politicians are actually quoting the First Amendment, stating their freedom of speech and religion is allowing them to practice these acceptable alternate lifestyles and to teach them, and that, this is okay. And in the school systems, I don't know if you know it, but your kids are being taught, LGBTQ lifestyles, and they're being integrated into their teachings, that being gay is acceptable, and teachers and school districts are wanting to hire transgender teachers and gay and lesbian teachers so they can be role models to these kind of students. And they used to be subtle, but they're not very subtle anymore. And they're not only teaching these kind of things to our children, but they're just teaching, like my little child has a teacher in a private school she goes to that's deathly afraid of COVID, and is teaching the children all about the necessity of the vaccination. And I have another teacher that was telling me how she was talking about how racism and the one 21-year-old in Georgia who shot up the Asian people, that was a race that was a racist attack, and because she's Asian, this is what she's teaching in her classrooms, and I saw it firsthand when my kids were being educated in a liberal small town in Hood River, Oregon, the evils of capitalism that they were being taught in their, social studies classes, and the intrigue and the necessity of government taking care of you, socialism, and hence these, stimulus checks are like, no one's even blinking an eye. Well, of course, it's absolutely necessary the government give us money so we can survive. So these things are all and have been taught to our children for some time now. And hence, you're seeing the statistics of abortion and crime and illegitimate births and rapes, and everything is up. Now, look, good people in America are not happy. I would dare say there's still the press, the social media would want you to think everyone's on board with all this. We're all fine. I have a tendency to believe still a majority of America is not happy with what they're seeing the young people are being taught and the fruits of these teachings that they're getting in school and in the universities. But, a lot of people just have no idea what to do about it. And you might have felt that way 9 weeks ago before you started coming to our classes online. What can I do? That you love the Constitution, but you really hadn't been taught that much about it, what the original intent of the founders were, and you actually believe that these irreligious practices that are being protected now and promoted in the schools, that people actually have the agency and free will to do this, and that these immoral and degenerate ideas are being taught and they're being accepted. And that's just, the modern time, way we're progressing. So you can see, girls, without religion and morality in the schools and in, the communities, our schools are a scary place. Public schools, even some private schools, are scary places to send our kids. And some of these communities are scary places to raise up our kids. The social scientists have taught that, insisted that public education was designed so that no student would be offended. Heaven forbid a child would be offended at school. And public education was faced with this dilemma of, oh boy, we got to please everyone. I mean, if we teach God at school, we're going to offend, if we teach Christian values, we're going to offend Jewish people. If we teach Jewish values, we're going to offend the Buddhist and Islamic. And if we teach God values, we're definitely going to offend the atheists. And so in their effort to please, they removed God, they removed religion, and our founders knew we would lose our country if we didn't teach religion and morality along with knowledge in our schools. And we are seeing the fruits. We're wreaking, lying in wake of these teachings. We're seeing these kids who are, drinking us up, smoking, vaping, rapes, abortion, suicides. It's been shocking the last, week and a half. A 21-year-old kid, went on a shooting rampage, and the mainstream media wanted to call it, a racial attack against Asians. But because this kid didn't resist arrest, he was actually alive to say, it had nothing to do with race. I am sexually addicted. I am addicted to pornography. I'm an addict. And it's interesting that no one wants to address the growing porn and sex industry that is, leading men and women to destroy their lives. And this young boy yesterday that had the rampage in Boulder, Colorado, I think that the media would have loved to have said that was a racial attack, but because he's got some Middle Eastern look or name, they can't exactly call it a racial attack. But what they are doing, this morning, all over the news, is it's a call for gun control, gun legislation. Pelosi, President Biden calling for more restrictions. And we know, our founders, that was our Second Amendment, the right to bear arms to keep us safe. If you disarm the citizenry, we are sitting ducks, are we not, for crazy people? So if a madman with a gun knows that half the people in the movie theater are carrying a gun, do you think he's going to go on a shooting rampage? Because he'll be taken out immediately. But can you see how they're trying to use these crises as a reason to take away our Second Amendment right to protect ourselves? And so, girls, we are finished. This is a lot of material. I know this seminar is kind of heavy duty because it's what everything is, wrong with America, why we're in the situation that we are. But you have to know, mamas, that the greatest threat to America is that most of us just don't know what made America great. And as we are learning these things, Mom, we're going to be able to go and teach our children and our grandchildren, and we'll help to be able to change their hearts and minds and really save this generation, this next generation who are really being deceived in the schools and the social media. Unless we really understand the nature of our problems and how we wandered away from these original founding moorings, it will be impossible to appreciate the task of putting it back together. What are the solutions? And remember, Seminar 4 talks about how we heal America. So hang in there, girls. I was right where you were about 12 years ago in Oregon when I moved to this small liberal town in Hood River, Oregon. And the mamas were worried about what was being taught in their schools. And so one of the moms saw this program by Glenn Beck. I didn't even know who Glenn Beck was. And he held up this book called the 5,000-year leap. And he said, mothers, you need to know these 28 principles. You need to get together in homes and study them with each other. And then you need to go and teach your children. And that's exactly what we mothers did. And those women are still meeting today. And because I'm in the state where these mamas meet, I'm going to try and go to their cottage meeting right after class today. But if I could tell you what those mothers that were not constitutional scholars, were not history, experts, have gone on to do, because they have just routinely met for a couple hours every week in someone's home, a little cottage meeting. They've gone on to write books, to have little radio shows, to do podcasts. Some of them pulled their kids out of school and put them in different schools or homeschooled them. The planned rallies. I mean, these ladies, just that their lives have been transformed as they have come together and studied and learned these principles. And then God has worked upon their hearts about different ways in which they can make a difference in their marriage, in their homes, with their grandchildren, within their communities, even their states and their nations. I'm a product of one of those mamas that was worried about what her kids were being taught in high school. So I started to meet together and we shared these ideas, and God has just gone to work with me. I mean, if you would have told me that I would have done some of the things that I'm doing now 10 and 12 years ago, I would have just laughed. Girls, if we can remember, we look to God for answers, for healing, for deliverance. We don't look to Joe Biden. We don't look to Washington, D.C. And we keep our family close. We make quality family time a high priority. So our kids, we can teach these things that we're learning to them, and be patient with your older kids, your adult children, and your teenage grandchildren. They're just a product of the indoctrination that they've been taught in the public school system. So as we keep them close and we share with them what they're learning, they will hear it. They will receive it. It will be planted in their hearts. They love you. You are their mothers. You're their grandmothers. You're their aunties. And as you continue to learn these things, learn what the founders gave us that they said came from God, God will let you know what to do and how to get involved and make a difference, because it will be you mamas that will wake up those around you. And you will be the impetus, I believe, that will cause the heavens to intervene, to have this nation endure, for God to heal this nation like he promised in 2 Chronicles 7:14. All throughout history, it has been the mamas who have changed the tide of history, because God has put into the mama's heart and mind an idea, and then she goes and teaches that to the child or to the person that she loves. The hand that rocks the cradle really does rule the world. So I commend you for being here and for learning and moving forward in faith, even though you're not quite sure what it's going to look like, down the road. You're here and you're showing God that you care and that you need his help, and he will help you. He will help us. So girls, that's the end of class. Whew, that was a lot of information. Go back and review it if you can. I will stay on and answer any questions that you have. But thank you so much for being here. We can do it, mamas. Let's not get discouraged. Knowledge is power. When we understand how we got broke, then we know how to fix it. And so we're on that course and that trajectory with the things that we're learning in our Healing of America seminar. So thank you so much. Have a great week, and we'll see you next Wednesday, same time, same place. Thank you, ladies.